Good morning, philosophers. Most of us believe in some kind of equality. Unlike people in earlier periods of history, many of whom thought that human beings are unequal by nature and that there's a natural hierarchy among humans, it is a foundational conviction of modern moral thought that all persons possess equal basic worth. In the words of Thomas Nagel, we believe that no one is more important than anyone else. Everyone counts the same. For a given quantity of whatever it is that is good or bad, suffering or happiness, or fulfillment or frustration, its intrinsic impersonal value doesn't depend on whose it is. From this basic belief in people's equal basic moral worth flow a number of further egalitarian convictions. Most of us believe that people should be equal before the law, that people have equal basic rights. We believe in political equality of a sort. The principle, one person, one vote, is sacrosanct in contemporary democracies. And many of us aspire to build a society that lives up to an ideal of social equality, that is, a society in which we relate to one another as equals, as opposed to a stratified society characterized by divisions of status or rank. However, though these kinds of equality are of great importance, they are not our subject today. What we will concern ourselves with in today's lecture is equality of a different sort, namely distributive equality, or equality as a principle for the distribution of goods, the sort of things that confer well-being on people. Why might equality in this sense be of moral concern? Let us distinguish two kinds of reasons. First, we might think that distributive equality matters instrumentally as a means to other things that we ultimately care about. For instance, we may believe that distributive equality is conducive towards some of the other forms of equality that we just mentioned, for example, political and social equality, and therefore be concerned with distributive equality for that reason. Without some measure of distributive equality, the thought goes, genuine political or social equality may be harder to achieve. There's a growing body of empirical evidence from the fields of epidemiology and public health that distributive equality may be helpful in achieving a whole host of other socially desirable outcomes as well, such as greater physical and mental health, lower rates of incarceration, higher social trust, greater social mobility, and so on. For a very readable compendium of research on these questions, I warmly recommend to you the book The Spirit Level: Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better, written by two British epidemiologists, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. Thirdly, we might care about distributive equality on utilitarian grounds. Now, those of you who are economists will be familiar with the so-called law of diminishing marginal utility of resources. This is the idea that as a person consumes a good or service, the utility or well-being that they derive from the good wanes as they consume more and more of it. The first unit of consumption yields more utility than the second and subsequent units, with a continuing reduction for greater amounts. This seems to clearly be the case for money, for example. Your first $50,000 of income provide you a way bigger boost in well-being than the next $50,000, and so on for ever higher incomes. From this thought, there's a relatively straightforward utilitarian argument for favoring equality in the distribution of resources. If resources have diminishing marginal utility, and everyone's utility function is broadly similar, then redistributing resources from those who have more to those who have less will tend to increase overall utility, all else equal. For that reason, a pure utilitarian whose only concern is with maximizing total utility may nonetheless have reason to prefer a more equal to a less equal distribution of resources, all else equal. It's important to note, however, that utilitarianism as a moral theory attaches no intrinsic significance or value to equality. Thus, consider the following numerical example in which the thing to be distributed is not resources, but well-being itself. In outcome one half of society, the haves, let's call them, have a well-being level of 100, whereas the other half of society, the have-nots, are at well-being level 10. In outcome 2, everyone enjoys a well-being level of 50. Now, although outcome 2 is the more equal outcome, a utilitarian will prefer outcome 1, since this is the outcome in which overall utility is maximized. The argument for distributive equality from the diminishing marginal utility of resources is likewise hostage to empirical fortune. It depends crucially on the assumption that people's utility functions, that is, the rate at which they convert resources into utility or well-being, are broadly similar. But imagine that things weren't so. Imagine that our society contained a hypothetical person whom Robert Nozick dubs the utility monster. Now, this person receives much more utility from each unit of a resource they consume than anyone else does. For example, imagine that eating a cookie might bring only 1 unit of utility to each of us, but a full 100 units of utility to the utility monster. Moreover, let's imagine that instead of resources having diminishing marginal utility, they have increasing marginal utility for the utility monster. So the more cookies the monster has already eaten, the greater the utility that the monster would derive from an extra cookie. In mathematical terms, we might say that the monster has a convex rather than a concave utility function. Now, in such a hypothetical scenario, utilitarianism would have grossly inegalitarian implications. It would imply that much of society's resources, indeed perhaps all of them, should go to the utility monster, since this is how we maximize utility in this case. As Nozick puts it, utilitarianism seems to require that we all be sacrificed in the monster's maw in order to increase total utility. All right, so what we've talked about so far are a variety of instrumental reasons for caring about distributive equality. But that isn't the main subject of our lecture. Our main subject is a commitment to distributive equality in a stronger sense, namely the view that distributive equality matters intrinsically or in its own right. To be an egalitarian in the sense that will concern us in today's lecture, you must believe that it matters in itself that people be equally well off. That is the thought that we will examine. Does it matter morally in itself that people be equally well off or not? The philosopher whose work we'll be discussing today is Derek Parfit. Parfit, born in 1942 in Chengdu in China and died January 1st, 2017 in Oxford, was one of the great geniuses of 20th century philosophy. He was also, for a period of about 10 years, my teacher. I'll have much more to say about Parfit's life and work and my time working with him in my penultimate lecture of the semester, when we will be discussing Parfit's path-breaking work on our moral obligations concerning future people. These are also some of the topics that we worked most closely together on. For today, I'll just let the brilliance of his ideas speak for themselves. Derek Parfit distinguishes between 2 families of views according to which equality and inequality matter intrinsically. Some egalitarians believe that if people were equally well off, that would be a better state of affairs. Following Parfit, let's call such egalitarians teleological or telic egalitarians for short. So telic egalitarianism affirms what Parfit calls the principle of equality, which says, it is in itself bad if some people are worse off than others. Now, this claim is crucial in distinguishing telic egalitarianism from other distributive principles that also support distributions approximating equality, but only because they serve some other value, such as the general welfare or political stability or fraternity. The mark of telic egalitarians, on the other hand, is that they take equality to be not merely instrumentally valuable, but good in itself. By contrast, what Parfit calls deontic egalitarians hold that though we should sometimes aim for equality, that is not because we shall thereby make the outcome better, but it is always for some other reason. For instance, not distributing resources equally when we are able to do so may constitute an injustice, which we have reason to avoid. So, according to the deontic egalitarian, inequality is not in itself a bad-making property of an outcome. Rather, we have reason to be concerned with inequality just in case it is the product of injustice, that is, if it results from unjust human agency. In such a case, we might say that an unequal outcome is a bad outcome. But this thought is derivative of the prior claim about injustice. Now, naturally occurring inequalities, which are not due to human agency and which human agency cannot remedy, are of no moral concern to the deontic egalitarian. Parfit gives the example of inequalities in our natural endowments, of innate talent or health. For deontic egalitarians, if nothing can be done to remove such inequalities, there can be no injustice. In the words of John Rawls, if some situation is unalterable, the question of justice does not arise. Now, of course, if we could redistribute talents or health from one person to another, then a question of justice might arise, and an unequal distribution of such talents might then strike us as morally problematic because unjust. But in the absence of such a possibility, deontic egalitarians see nothing morally problematic in the inequalities produced by the random shuffling of our genes. Telic egalitarians, by contrast, take a different view. They believe that, even when inequality is unavoidable, it is in itself bad or regrettable. It is bad or regrettable, they think, if, through no fault of their own, some people are worse off than others, even if there's sadly nothing we can do about this. So telic and deontic egalitarians agree that inequality is of concern in itself, and not just because of possible bad effects that it produces. But they differ with regard to why they consider inequality to be of moral concern. Now, this difference with regard to the reasons that we have for objecting to inequality, according to telic and deontic egalitarians, also affects the scope of our egalitarian concern. The telic egalitarian's concern will tend to be wider than that of the deontic egalitarian. As Parfit writes in his 1991 Lindley lecture, I quote, "If it is in itself bad if some people are worse off than others, as the telic egalitarian believes, why should it matter where or when these people live? On such a view, it is in itself bad if there are, or have been, even in unrelated communities and in different centuries, people who are not equally well off. Thus, it is bad that Inca peasants or Stone Age hunter-gatherers were worse off than we are now. By contrast, such inequalities between people living in different periods of history or between people living in societies that cannot physically interact with each other are of no concern to the deontic egalitarian. If there's nothing anyone could have done to remedy such inequalities, the deontic egalitarian reasons, they could not be the product of injustice. Hence, they are of no moral concern to him. Now, in today's lecture, following Derek Parfit, we will focus primarily on telic egalitarianism. So, let's look a little more closely at the commitments of this view. We've seen that telic egalitarians believe that equality is intrinsically valuable. Hence, they accept a second claim, namely that a more equal outcome is in one respect better than a less equal outcome. However, it is important to note that telic egalitarians are not committed to claiming that of two outcomes, the more equal one is necessarily better, all things considered. all reasonable egalitarians are pluralists, who believe that besides equality, there are other things that matter, such as total well-being or a decent minimum, which in some situations can only be realized at the price of greater inequality. Therefore, alongside the principle of equality, pluralist Tillich egalitarians may also subscribe, for example, to what Parfit calls the principle of utility, which says that it is in itself better if people are better off overall. So notice that the principle of equality and the principle of utility can pull in opposite directions in some cases. How are we then to weight these competing values against one another when they do? Let's consider a toy example. So consider a choice between three options. In outcome A, everyone in our society is at well-being level 150. In outcome B, half are at 199, half are at 200. In outcome C, half are at level 101, half are at 200. Let's make this our first thinking exercise for the day. So I want you to consider three questions. First, how would a pure egalitarian, that is someone who cares only about equality and nothing else, rank these three options from best to worst? Second, how would a pure utilitarian, that is someone who cares only about overall utility and nothing else, rank these three outcomes? And thirdly, how would a pluralist egalitarian, for whom both equality and overall utility matter, rank them? Take a few moments to consider these three questions. I'll see you on the other side. All right, welcome back. Here are the answers to our thinking exercise. Pure egalitarians would rank the distributions in the following manner. A is better than B is better than C. For pure utilitarians, that is those that care only about total utility, the ranking is B is better than C is better than A. Pluralist egalitarians, that is those who try to strike some reasonable balance between equality and overall utility, for them the ordering would most likely be B is better than A is better than C. Now, obviously, the trade-off between equality and overall utility is not always that easy to make. Our intuitions about the relative weight of equality and utility may be quite imprecise. For example, given a choice between everyone being at 150 and half the population being at N and half at 200, it's a bit hard to say at what value of N pluralist egalitarians should switch from preferring outcome A to outcome D. As Parfit writes, for some range of values, such as 120 to 150, we may find this question hard to answer, and it may not have an answer. The relative importance of equality and utility may be, even in principle, imprecise. So, pluralist egalitarianism is what John Rawls, in his theory of justice, calls an intuitionist view. We give weight to both equality and utility, but we have no principled way to assess their relative importance. To defend a particular decision, we can only claim that it seems right, and our intuitions aren't always precise. All right, so having characterized Tillich egalitarianism, let us now look at some possible criticisms of this view. In his paper, Parfit considers two objections in particular. The first takes the following form. Suppose half the population is born with two functioning eyes, and the other half with no functioning eye. Now, by taking an eye from the sighted and giving it to the blind, let's imagine that we could enable everyone to see. Moreover, this would reduce the inequality between the sighted and the blind. But nonetheless, doing so would strike many people as wrong, even monstrous. So Telic egalitarianism should be rejected, the argument goes. So as I said, Parfit considers this type of objection to Telic egalitarianism, but he finds it unpersuasive. The key mistake of this objection, he thinks, is to assume, wrongly, that egalitarianism would actually endorse such a policy of redistributing eyes. But Telic egalitarians are not at all committed to this view. As Parfit writes, quote, "Some people would reject this policy, believing that it violates the rights of sighted twins, sighted people. But that belief provides no ground for rejecting the Telic view. As pluralists, Telic egalitarians could agree that the state should not redistribute organs. Since they do not believe equality to be the only value, they could agree that, in this example, some other principle has greater weight or is overriding. Their belief is only that, if we all had one eye, this would be in one way better than if half of us had two eyes and the other half had none. Far from being horrific, that belief is clearly true. If we all had one eye, that would be much better for all of the people who would otherwise be blind." End quote. Let us look at a second kind of objection to Telic egalitarianism. However, rather than having me present the objection to you, I have a bit of political history to share with you. The date is November 22nd, 1990. The scene is London, the British Houses of Parliament to be precise, where the departing Conservative Prime Minister, the formidable Margaret Thatcher, is in the midst of her last parliamentary debate. Roll the tape.
I give way to the honourable gentleman.
There is no doubt that the Prime Minister has in many ways achieved substantial success for the economy. There is one statistic that I understand is not, however, challengeable, and that is that over her 11 years, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country has widened substantially.
That's right.
How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics that she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer off, much less well housed, and much less well provided than it was in 1979? Surely she accepts that is not a record that she or any Prime Minister can be proud of.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That is a Liberal policy. Yes, it came out, he didn't intend it to, but he did. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm extremely grateful. The Prime Minister is aware that I detest every single one of her domestic policies and have never hid that.
And I think that the honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe who have experienced it have it for theirs. I think I must have hit the right nail on the head when I pointed out that the logic of those policies are they'd rather have the poor poorer. Once they start to talk about the gap, they'd rather the gap were that. Down here. That. Not that. But that. So long as the gap is smaller, they'd rather have the poor poorer. You do not create wealth and opportunity that way. You do not create a property-owning democracy that way.
Phew! They didn't call her the Iron Lady for nothing. Let's do a bit of philosophical analysis on the scene we just witnessed. The first questioner, Simon Hughes of the Liberal Democrat Party, is clearly a committed egalitarian. He takes Thatcher to task over the fact that during her period in office, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% has widened substantially. Thatcher's retort is very interesting. All levels of income are better off than they were in 1979, the year she came to power, she begins. And then she launches her counterattack. The logic of an egalitarian position like Hughes's, she thunders, is that they would rather the poor are poorer, provided the gap with the rich is smaller. In other words, they would favor policies that reduce the inequality between the better off and the worse off, even if this is in fact better for no one and makes some worse off. Now, consider the two diagrams you see to my left, where the width of a box represents the number of people and the height of the box represents their level of well-being. So Thatcher is suggesting that in each of these diagrams, Telic egalitarians would prefer outcome B to outcome A, since there's less or even no inequality in outcome B compared to outcome A. But surely, she thinks, that's a very unattractive view to hold. In both diagrams, outcome B is worse for some people and better for none compared to outcome A. Given this, it seems grotesque to suggest that B is a better state of affairs than A. So let's call this Thatcher's objection to Telic egalitarianism. So let's ask, and this is going to be our second thinking exercise of the day, does Thatcher's objection to Telic egalitarianism hit its mark? Would Telic egalitarianism actually commit its adherents to preferring outcome B to outcome A, all things considered, in both of these diagrams? Take a few minutes to consider it. All right, welcome back. The question with which I left you was this. Are Telic egalitarians actually committed, by the logic of their position, to preferring outcome B to outcome A in both of the diagrams to my left? The answer is no. Telic egalitarians are not committed to such an implausible position. Why? Well, recall that we said earlier that all reasonable Telic egalitarians are pluralists, who, besides their concern for equality, also have an independent concern for the overall well-being. As a result, they would rarely, if ever, advocate for a change such as the move from A to B that is better for no one and worse for some, since that would involve an important loss of total welfare. Pluralist egalitarians would judge that, all things considered, moving from A to B does not improve, but rather worsens the outcome. So they are not committed to picking B over A in either diagram. However, while Thatcher's attempted reductio ad absurdum of Telic egalitarianism fails, her critique is not totally on the wrong track. In his paper, Parfit argues that the kinds of cases illustrated by the diagrams reveal a subtle, but nonetheless potent problem with Telic egalitarianism. Suppose, as in the second diagram, that we can achieve greater equality only by leveling down, that is, by making some worse off without making anyone better off. By the way, Kurt Vonnegut's story, Harrison Bergeron, which was our bonus reading for today, is a drastic literary example of leveling down in action. I really recommend it to you. Now, as we've just seen, pluralist Telic egalitarians are not committed to the view that we ought to level down, all things considered, nor indeed to the view that the new outcome with greater equality would be better, all things considered, than the less equal one. However, Telic egalitarians are committed to the following claim. Since equality is intrinsically valuable, the new distribution B is better, at least in one respect, than A, namely in virtue of being more equal. But is it really? The move from A to B is worse for some and better for none. How could a change that is worse for some and better for none result in an outcome that is better in any respect. As Parfit writes, I quote, "Suppose that in some natural disaster, those who are better off lose all their extra resources and become as badly off as everyone else. Since this change would remove the inequality, it must be in one way welcome on the telic view. Though this disaster would be worse for some people and better for no one, it must be in one way a change for the better. Similarly, it would be in one way an improvement if we destroyed the eyes of the sighted, not to benefit the blind, but only to make the sighted blind. These implications can be more plausibly regarded as monstrous or absurd. The appeal to such examples we can call the leveling down objection." Now, if this more subtle objection goes through, it is a devastating blow to telic egalitarianism. Proponents of the leveling down objection claim that their argument shows that many of us mistakenly identify as egalitarians, when in fact our real concern is for the fate of the badly off. We are in favor of creating equality, they maintain, because in most cases reducing inequality implies redistributing from the well-off to the badly off. The leveling down objection, however, shows that the connection between reducing inequality and improving the well-being of the badly off is merely contingent. In cases of leveling down, the elimination of inequality does not translate into welfare gains for the badly off. So the force of the leveling down objection is to try and persuade us that there's nothing intrinsically good about creating equality in this way. If we accept this conclusion, however, proponents of the objection maintain, it has been shown that we do not hold the creation of equality to be intrinsically good. Instead, we value it only instrumentally, as a means of helping the badly off. Now, suppose you are persuaded by this objection to telic egalitarianism. Suppose you've come now to think that what really matters are not relational facts about how well people fare compared to one another. Rather, the only thing that matters is how well people fare absolutely, especially the worst off. Prioritarians believe that we should give priority to helping the badly off, which is to say that a benefit matters more the worse off the individual to whom it accrues. As Parfit puts it, quote, "The moral value of raising a person's utility by a given amount is greater the worse off the recipient." End quote. A prioritarian agrees with a telic egalitarian that, all else equal, it is better if a given quantity of utility is given to a worse off rather than to a better off person. But at the same time, the priority view denies that equality has any intrinsic value in itself. Helping the worst off has moral priority. But this is not because they are relatively worse off than others, but simply in virtue of their absolute level of deprivation. Unlike the telic egalitarian, a prioritarian judges that a benefit to an individual at a particular level of welfare has the same moral value, no matter what levels other individuals are at. According to prioritarianism, benefits to the badly off matter more, not because of the relation between the badly off to other people, but because of the absolute level the badly off are themselves. Consider the following very helpful analogy from Parfit. I quote, "People at higher altitudes find it harder to breathe. Is this because they are higher up than other people? In one sense, yes. But they would find it just as hard to breathe even if there were no other people who were lower down. In the same way, on the priority view, benefits to the worse off matter more, but that is only because these people are at a lower absolute level. It is irrelevant that these people are worse off than others. Benefits to them would matter just as much even if there were no others who were better off." I think it's instructive to compare the moral priority that prioritarianism assigns to improving the well-being of the badly off with the concept of diminishing marginal utility that we encountered at the start of this lecture. So I said one of the standard assumptions of utilitarianism is that a given bundle of resources will procure a smaller increment in utility for a person the more resources she already has at her disposal. And since utilitarianism aims to maximize the total amount of utility in society, this indirectly leads utilitarianism to attempt to equalize everyone's quantity of resources and thereby well-being. Now, prioritarians, in addition, believe that if benefits go to people who are better off, these benefits matter less. As Parfit puts it, just as resources have diminishing marginal utility, so utility has diminishing marginal moral importance. Whenever we transfer resources to people who are worse off, the resulting benefits will not merely be in themselves greater due to the effect of diminishing marginal utility. They will also, on the moral scale, matter more. There are thus two ways in which the outcome will be better from the point of view of prioritarianism. Now, it is important to understand that the assumption that utility possesses diminishing marginal moral importance commits the prioritarian to distinguishing between two types of value, which we shall call personal and impersonal value. The personal value of a given good is its value for the recipient, that is, the increase in well-being that it procures him. The impersonal value of allocating a good to a person, by contrast, designates the impact that allocating this good to him has on the overall goodness of the outcome. Now, prioritarianism does not deny that from the point of view of the recipients, it has the same personal value to raise the utility of a well-off person by n units of well-being, as giving the same n units of well-being to a badly off person. What it does claim is that giving the good to a worse-off person leads to a distribution that is morally better, that is higher in impersonal value. Let us consider some of the implications of prioritarianism as a position in distributive ethics. Now, in most cases, prioritarianism has the same implications for how we ought to choose or act, all things considered, as pluralist egalitarianism. So, return to our earlier choice. Like pluralist egalitarians, prioritarians would most likely support the following ranking of our three options. B is better than A is better than C. In particular, A is better than C despite the greater total well-being in C, because the worse off fare far better in absolute terms in A than in C. By the way, I should also note that while prioritarianism accords a degree of priority to the worst off, this degree of priority need not be infinite. To make that concrete, consider a choice between D, where half the population is at 101, half is at 120, and E, where half the population is at 100 and half is at 250. Now, given such a choice, a prioritarian may well opt for E over D, because although the worse-off group is slightly worse off in E than in D, moving from D to E makes a massive positive difference to the better-off group. Okay, so the crucial selling point of the priority view, of course, is that unlike telic egalitarianism, prioritarianism avoids the leveling down objection. Since for the prioritarian, there is no objection to inequality per se. Inequality isn't intrinsically bad, according to the prioritarian. There therefore is no reason to make the better off worse off if we cannot also improve the absolute standing of the worse off. Moreover, prioritarians can deny that the level down outcome is better than the less equal outcome in any respect. So prioritarianism avoids the leveling down objection. Here's a third thinking exercise for you, and I warn you, this one is really hard, so don't feel bad if you're stumped by it. So I said a moment ago that in most cases, prioritarianism has the same implications for how we ought to choose or act, all things considered, as does pluralist egalitarianism. Now, notice that this is true even in the leveling down cases, because, as I explained, Tillich egalitarianism isn't committed to the claim that we ought to level down, all things considered, only to the claim that outcome B is, at least in some respect, better than outcome A. Okay, so my challenge to you is this. Are there any cases where prioritarianism and pluralistic Tillich egalitarianism would give different verdicts about which of two outcomes we ought to choose? Again, this is a tough one, but have a think for a few minutes and see what you come up with. I'll wait for you. Okay, welcome back. Well, I think that although for most practical purposes a prioritarian ordering of distributions does not differ from an egalitarian one, I think that it is possible to construct cases in which the two views may differ in their distributive implications. So consider the following distributions of welfare: A, B, C, and D. Take a moment to take in the example. All right, so I think we can say the following. A prioritarian prefers A to B if and only if he judges that C is better than D. The reason is that the only difference between A and B is in the well-beings of the first two people, and there's exactly the same difference between C and D. But the prioritarian, remember, does not care about relational facts vis-à-vis third parties. So the well-being of everyone else is irrelevant to the comparison and can be ignored. To the egalitarian, however, things look different. Distribution A has the merit of equality, which C does not share. So there's an egalitarian reason for thinking A better than B that is not also a reason for thinking C better than D. On the other hand, D is plausibly better than C because of its greater total well-being. So an egalitarian may well think that A is better than B and D is better than C. This view is inconsistent with prioritarianism, but it is a principled egalitarian view. We now come to the final part of today's lecture. We've seen that the case against Tillich egalitarianism and in favor of the priority view turns on an argument by counterexample, the leveling down objection. What I want to do in closing is look more closely at this objection to determine how strong it is. Now, one kind of response that a committed Tillich egalitarian might try to give to the leveling down objection is to challenge whether there are, in fact, genuine cases of leveling down, that is, ones where we remove inequality purely by making some people worse off, without making anyone better off in any respect. Some philosophers, such as the British philosopher John Broome in his book Weighing Goods, published in 1991, hold that reducing inequality is always good for people, at least in one respect, since existing inequalities are intrinsically bad for them. Now, Parfit considers this line of response, but he's unimpressed, as he writes, "The mere fact of inequality is not in itself bad for the people who are worse off. Such inequalities may be naturally unfair, and it would of course be better for these people if they themselves were better off. But it would not be better for them if, without any effects on them, the other people were just as badly off. Inequality may of course have bad effects, but these are irrelevant here. We are concerned with the mere fact that I am worse off than other people. To isolate this fact, we can suppose that I am not aware of these people and that their existence has no other effect on me. We may then rephrase our question. Can it be bad for me that, unknown to me, there are other people who are better off than me? And Parfit is convinced that this question must be answered in the negative. Let us consider a second line of response to Parfit, this one more promising, I think. The philosopher Larry Temkin, who teaches just up the road at Rutgers University, is a committed telic egalitarian, and a brilliant one at that. In his article, Equality, Priority, and the Leveling Down Objection, Temkin sets out to defend telic egalitarianism against the force of the leveling down objection. Temkin argues in this article that the leveling down objection gets much of its intuitive force from our implicit adherence to the following thought. How could one situation be better than another if there's no one for whom the former outcome is better than the latter? Now, Parfit in his article calls this the person-affecting view. Temkin thinks that the person-affecting view can be sharpened into a more precise claim, which he dubs the slogan. It goes like this. One situation cannot be worse or better than another in any respect if there is no one for whom it is worse or better in any respect. The thought is, telic egalitarians are committed to the claim that leveling down is good, at least in one respect, since it makes the outcome more equal. Thus, outcome B is better than outcome A in at least one respect, since it is more equal. But how could this be true, given that B isn't better for anyone in any respect? That is the force of the slogan. So as Temkin sees it, whether or not the leveling down objection to telic egalitarianism succeeds ultimately turns on whether or not we should accept the slogan. So in his article, Temkin proposes a variety of objections and counterexamples to the slogan. We will consider the most famous, his so-called saints and sinners case. So consider a world in which the evilest mass murderers fare better than the most benign saints. Would there not be something bad about this world in which virtue is so ill rewarded? And yet, if we assume that none of the saints know that the mass murderers are better off than they are, such a state of affairs might be bad for no one. Assume further that we had it in our power to reduce the well-being of the mass murderers to a level that we feel they justly deserve to be at, far below that of the saints, but that such a change cannot in any way make the saints themselves better off. Wouldn't we nevertheless believe that there is something good about such a change, even though, strictly speaking, it is good for no one and bad for some? So what do you think? Has Temkin given us a convincing counterexample to the slogan, and thereby blunted the force of Parfit's leveling down objection to telic egalitarianism? Or are there perhaps morally significant differences between Temkin's saints and sinners case and Parfit's leveling down case? Perhaps the fact that the saints and sinners in the saints and sinners case desert plays a role, whereas this factor seems absent in Parfit's case. Would that perhaps mean that our judgments about the saints and sinners case don't easily carry over to Parfit's cases? Is Temkin even right to assume that accepting the slogan is crucial to the success of the leveling down objection? Or might the objection be sustained without relying on the slogan? These are among the questions that I look forward to taking up at our next town hall. Until then.